Scaphism. In ancient Persia, the punishment known as Scaphism, or the boats, was engineered to inflict prolonged, torturous death in one of the most psychologically devastating manners imaginable. The condemned would be trapped between two hollowed-out logs or boats, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. To start the ordeal, they were force-fed milk and honey until they could consume no more. This forced feeding led to severe diarrhea, coating the victim and attracting swarms of insects. Honey was also smeared on exposed skin to further lure flies, beetles, and ants. As insects feasted and laid eggs, larvae burrowed into the person's skin, worsening their suffering. Bound tightly, the victim remained trapped in these increasingly unbearable conditions for days, even weeks, fully conscious as insects ate into their flesh. Dehydration, exposure, and eventual septic infection would cause death, but the suffering could be extended as long as the victim's body could endure. Persian authorities reserved this punishment for criminals deemed exceptionally heinous, such as traitors, and its psychological impact was as devastating as the physical toll. Helplessly decomposing alive, victims experienced some of the worst suffering known to humankind. Scaphism symbolized a terrifying level of cruelty in ancient Persia, a reminder of the empire's absolute power and its merciless approach to punishment. Lingchi. Lingchi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was one of the most dreaded punishments in imperial China and was used until the early 20th century. Reserved for those who committed extreme crimes like treason, patricide, or other serious offenses, Lingchi was both a physical and spiritual punishment. The process involved binding the condemned to a wooden frame in a public square, where crowds would gather to watch. Executioners, highly skilled in prolonging pain, would begin with shallow cuts to limbs, being careful to avoid arteries that could hasten death. The first cuts would draw cries of pain as each slice deepened. Over time, the cuts moved to more sensitive areas, like the torso and chest, slicing through muscle and nerves to intensify suffering. Sometimes this torture lasted hours, with the victim fully aware of the gradual dismemberment. Family members too suffered shame, as witnessing this horrific punishment tainted the entire family's honor. In Confucian culture, bodily mutilation also prevented reincarnation, marking Lingchi as a spiritual sentence of eternal condemnation. Lingchi left a dark legacy in Chinese history, serving as both a warning and a haunting reminder of the state's power over life, death, and the afterlife. The vivid memory of this punishment lingered, casting a shadow on the public consciousness long after its abolition. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull stands as one of history's most horrific torture devices, invented in ancient Greece during the rule of the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas, Sicily. Designed by the metalworker Pericles, this device was a hollow brass bull with a door on its side. Once a victim was locked inside, a fire was lit beneath the belly of the bull, slowly heating the metal and roasting the person alive. Ingeniously, but grotesquely, a series of tubes and pipes inside the bull transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling a bull's roar. Phalaris initially intended the device to intimidate his enemies, but legend has it that he eventually turned on its creator, making Pericles the first person to suffer in his own invention. This dark innovation exemplified cruelty and dehumanization, with the torture lasting as long as the victim could endure the scorching heat. The story of the Brazen Bull is steeped in both historical accounts and legend. According to some sources, Phalaris was so pleased with this device that he would often use it to execute political rivals or those who displeased him. The bull was not just a tool for execution, it became a symbol of tyranny and cruelty in ancient Greece. The sheer horror of being trapped within a metal structure that transformed one's cries into an animalistic roar serves as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for inventiveness in cruelty. The design of the Brazen Bull itself is noteworthy. Crafted from bronze, it was meticulously engineered to ensure that the victim would suffer as much as possible before succumbing to death. The fire underneath would create an unbearable heat, intensifying with time. Moreover, the psychological aspect of being enclosed in such a terrifying contraption added to the torment. Victims would be fully aware of their impending doom as they were subjected to this agonizing fate. In modern times, the Brazen Bull has been referenced in various forms of media and literature as an example of extreme punishment and barbarism. Its legacy continues to evoke horror and fascination, serving as a stark reminder of how far humanity can go in its pursuit of control and punishment. Impalement. Impalement, a notoriously brutal punishment, became infamous through Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, also known as Dracula. Vlad's preferred method of punishment involved driving a sharpened stake through the body of the condemned, often from the lower body upward. Skilled executioners would carefully insert the stake, avoiding major organs to prolong the victim's suffering. In this way, the person would remain alive for hours, sometimes even days, slowly sliding downward as gravity pulled them along the stake. Vlad impaled thousands of his enemies, especially during his campaigns against the Ottoman Turks, reportedly leaving entire fields lined with impaled bodies. This grisly sight not only served to intimidate his enemies, but also to instill fear among his own people. Records suggest that invaders were often struck with horror upon encountering these fields, reconsidering their plans in the face of such terror. Though practiced in various cultures, Vlad's prolific use of impalement became infamous, making him a figure of both fear and legend. His nickname, Vlad Dracula, inspired vampire lore, with his reputation as a bloodthirsty leader solidifying his place in history as one of the most fearsome rulers of medieval Europe. Impalement was not only a means of death, but a lasting image of brutal authority, reinforcing his legacy. Breaking on the wheel. Breaking on the wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a punishment widely feared across medieval Europe, reserved for the most severe crimes such as murder, treason, and grave robbery. In this punishment, the condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel, with limbs spread out and secured tightly. Executioners would then use heavy iron bars to methodically smash the bones in the arms and legs, ensuring that each limb was broken in several places. Skilled in their craft, some executioners could avoid shattering the skin, ensuring that the person remained alive but in unbearable pain. The broken limbs were sometimes woven through the wheel's spokes, and in some cases, the individual would be left for days in this twisted, mangled state until death finally came. The Catherine wheel became infamous as an instrument of public spectacle, used to remind people of the consequences of severe crimes. Named after Saint Catherine, who was said to be martyred on a similar device, the punishment was particularly harrowing to watch. The condemned's helpless suffering demonstrated the state's unyielding control over justice. Publicly displayed, breaking on the wheel reinforced social order through fear, leaving a powerful impact on medieval communities. Its brutal nature made it a haunting symbol of the dark side of medieval justice, where punishment was as much about deterrence as it was about death. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle was an agonizing torture method widely used during the Spanish Inquisition to punish heretics. The device was essentially a large pyramid-shaped wooden seat, with the victim stripped and bound above it. Forced to sit upon the point of the pyramid, their own weight would gradually impale them over time. Torturers used this device to inflict prolonged suffering without a swift death, adjusting weights or bindings to extend the torture for hours or even days. The cradle's insidious design targeted the victim's most vulnerable areas, causing extreme pain and humiliation. In addition to physical suffering, it often led to fatal infections, as the device was rarely cleaned. Through this method, the Inquisition made a brutal example of those it deemed enemies, displaying the extremes of medieval cruelty. The psychological impact of such torture cannot be overstated. Victims were not only subjected to physical pain, but also public humiliation, as they were often paraded through towns before being tortured. The Judas Cradle's design allowed for various adaptations, depending on the torturer's intent. Some versions included additional features, such as ropes or weights, that could be adjusted to increase pain or prolong suffering further. This adaptability made it an especially feared instrument during its time. Historical accounts suggest that many victims did not survive this ordeal due to severe injuries or infections resulting from prolonged exposure to such brutality. The psychological terror instilled by devices like the Judas Cradle contributed significantly to maintaining control over populations during periods of intense persecution. Sawing. Sawing, a punishment used in medieval Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East, involved hanging the condemned upside down with legs spread. Executioners would begin cutting through the body, usually from the groin down to the head. This upside-down position allowed blood to rush to the brain, keeping the person conscious as long as possible to experience the agonizing pain. Sawing could be prolonged for hours, with the victim feeling every excruciating inch as the saw advanced toward vital organs. This punishment was especially common for serious crimes like heresy, witchcraft, and political dissent, where authorities intended to make a profound example. Spectators were often invited to witness, heightening the fear of defying the law. As the saw moved through flesh and bone, the screams of the victim underscored the brutality of medieval justice, where the goal was not just punishment, but an unforgettable display. Sawing left deep psychological scars on communities, serving as a symbol of the extremes rulers would go to in the pursuit of obedience and authority. Flaying alive. Flaying, the act of removing a person's skin while they were still alive, was a punishment used in ancient empires such as Assyria and the Aztec civilization. This excruciatingly painful method required that the victim be restrained, after which their skin was carefully cut and peeled back in strips, revealing exposed muscle, nerve endings, and tissue. As the person's skin was removed, agony surged through their body, amplified by every second of exposure to open air. In Assyria, flaying was often inflicted upon prisoners of war or those who defied the king, with many reports describing how the skins of the flayed were displayed on city walls as grim warnings to any potential rebels or foreign adversaries. The terrifying visual and psychological effects on onlookers were profound, turning a single flayed body into a message of absolute submission. For the Aztecs, flaying sometimes served a religious purpose, particularly in ceremonies associated with Totec, the god of agriculture, life, death, and rebirth. In these sacrificial rituals, the skin of the sacrificed would be worn by priests, symbolizing renewal and the cyclical nature of life and death. For victims, flaying was among the most agonizing deaths imaginable, especially given that the process was often prolonged to increase their suffering. The psychological impact of flaying on the public was intended to reinforce the dominance of rulers, who wielded the power to inflict such horrors at will. Though this punishment is now a distant historical memory, the horror it invoked has left a lasting impact, preserving it as one of the most brutal forms of punishment ever devised in human history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most horrifying punishments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics.